My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 33, an ER charge nurse in a mid-sized Texas hospital, and I've spent 9 years learning what a child's body says when a child's mouth won't. Last spring, my 8-year-old son came home from his grandfather's birthday weekend and refused to change for gym class for 11 straight days. I didn't scream. I didn't post anything online. I photographed, I documented. I drove to urgent care and wrote down every date the way I was trained to. By the following Friday, the man my whole family called a saint had lost the thing he loved most in this world. But it's what my own mother offered me across her dining table 3 weeks later that you will not believe. If stories like this hit home for you, stay to the end, and tell me in the comments if your family ever chose the wrong person to protect. Let me take you back to a Sunday evening and a boy who wouldn't take off his jacket. Eli is my only child. Quiet, funny in the dry way 8-year-olds sometimes are, obsessed with dinosaurs the way most boys his age are obsessed with something. His grandfather, my stepfather Roy, had raised me from the age of 9 after my own father left, and for 24 years I believed the sun rose because Roy Kessler said it should. He coached Little League for 2 decades. He was a deacon at Grace Fellowship. He was, by every account except the one that turned out to matter, a good man. Once a month, Roy and my mother took Eli for what they called Grandpa Weekend, and for 4 years it had meant fishing, pancakes, and Roy teaching him to whittle. That particular weekend was Roy's 65th birthday, and my mother had asked to keep Eli an extra night so they could all go to church together Sunday morning. I said yes without a second thought because there had never been a reason not to. When Roy dropped him off Sunday evening, Eli was wearing a denim jacket zipped to his chin. It was 81 degrees outside. Roy stood on my porch with his easy grin, the one that had charmed 3 decades of Little League parents, and said Eli was just tired from all the excitement. My son slid past him without a hug, which wasn't like him, and went straight to his room. At dinner, he pushed his food around the plate and answered in single words. My kid narrates everything, every dinosaur fact, until I beg him to stop. That night, he asked to sleep in the jacket. When I reached to help him change, he flinched so hard he knocked his lamp off the nightstand, then apologized to me for it, a detail I still can't let go of. I told myself he was overtired. I've sat across from 100 parents in triage telling themselves that exact lie, and I recognized it in my own mouth. You should know what my life looked like before that week, because I did not go looking for a reason to blow it up. I picked up extra shifts to keep Eli in the good school district. His father, my ex-husband Marcus, moved out of state 2 years ago and calls every Sunday without fail, but the day-to-day is mine. My mother Carol and Roy lived 40 minutes away, and Grandpa Weekend was the one thing in my calendar I never had to think twice about. Roy had never so much as raised his voice around Eli in 4 years. There was no red flag. The man had coached 200 kids over the years, and half the parents in that town would have handed him their sons blind. Monday is bath night in my house. Eli treats a bathtub like a submarine, and I usually can't get him out of it. That Monday, he stood in the hallway and told me for the first time ever that he didn't want a bath. I kept my voice easy the way I do with kids who go rigid at a needle. I told him fine, no bath, but we needed clean clothes, and I moved the zipper down slowly while he watched my hands. He let me. That's the detail that still wakes me up, how he let me, like some part of him had been waiting for a grown-up to insist. The jacket came off. His shirt sleeve rode up with it, and I stopped being his mother for about 10 seconds and became a nurse, because that was the only way to stay standing. Along his left forearm, 3 long parallel welts, raised and darkening from red toward purple at the edges. On his lower back, a bruise the size of my palm shaped almost like a belt buckle. I've charted marks like this more times than I can count, and a phrase from mandatory training scrolled through my head like a warning banner. Linear bruising with sharp edges doesn't come from falling off a bike. It comes from an object swung. Eli watched my face the way children do when they're checking whether the world is about to break, so I made my expression flat and steady, something he could lean his whole weight on. And I sat on the edge of the tub and asked him the softest question I know. I asked if his arm hurt. He said not really anymore. I asked what happened, then did the hardest thing a parent can do, which is stop talking and let silence be a room the child has to choose to walk into. It came out sideways the way it always does. He'd knocked over Grandpa's tackle box Saturday afternoon and the hooks spilled everywhere. Grandpa has a belt for that, he told his niece, the brown one from the garage, not the church belt. Grandpa said big boys don't cry about a whooping, and what happens at Grandpa's house is between men. Then he looked at the bathwater and said the sentence I'll hear the rest of my life. Grandma stayed in the kitchen the whole time and didn't come out until it was over. Every alarm I owned went off at once, and I did what I've trained other nurses to do: silence every alarm on the outside while it screams on the inside. You don't interrogate a child. You don't lead them. I told Eli thank you for telling me that none of it was his fault, that the tackle box didn't matter one bit. He almost smiled. I got him into soft pajamas, put on cartoons, and stepped into the hallway, where my hands did what 11 years of training taught them to do without me deciding. I photographed every mark with a tape measure for scale, called the 24-hour pediatric urgent care where Dr. Whitaker was on shift, a woman who's read more small bodies than anyone in this county, and said the sentence that starts everything: I'm bringing in my son and I need injuries documented tonight. Dr. Whitaker examined Eli like he was made of glass. She measured each welt, photographed them with a clinical camera and a case number in frame, and asked easy questions that got hard answers. When he mentioned the belt from the garage, her pen didn't stop, but her eyes came up and found mine for exactly 1 second. Afterward, in the hallway, she told me plainly, colleague to colleague, that she was required to call it in tonight. That it stopped being a family matter the moment she documented a patterned injury on a minor. Here is a confession I have only ever said out loud to a camera. What I felt was relief. Relief that the report would come from a mandated reporter with a medical license, and not from the daughter who Roy had raised since she was 9 and who everyone would assume was overreacting. Or worse, ungrateful. Because I had been the overreacting daughter before, in a different way, long ago. When I was 14, I told my mother that a youth pastor's hands had lingered somewhere they shouldn't have during a counseling session. There was no bruise to photograph that time. There was only my word, and in my mother's house, my word had never once outweighed a good man's reputation. She told me I had misread a hug, and not to make trouble for a man who did so much for our church. I learned a lesson that night, just not the one she thought she was teaching. I learned that in my family, the truth needed paperwork before it was allowed to exist. Driving home from urgent care with Eli asleep in the back seat, I understood the week ahead of me the way you understand a storm rolling in on the horizon. My mother didn't know yet. By Tuesday, she would. She called me Tuesday morning before I'd finished my coffee, her voice pitched high and bright in a way I recognized as fear wearing a party dress. Roy had gotten a call from someone at the department, she said, something about a misunderstanding with the tackle box. She wanted to come by that evening to clear the air as a family. I told her I couldn't discuss an open investigation, which was true, and bought me time I badly needed. By 6, her car was in my driveway anyway, uninvited, sitting at my kitchen table with her purse in her lap like a small, nervous animal. My mother raised me alone after my father left, married Roy when I was 9, and has run the Women's Auxiliary at Grace Fellowship for 15 years. She is not a shouter, she is a decider. She decides what a thing is, and the family lives inside that decision. Show me what all this fuss is about, she said. I could have refused. Instead, some part of me, maybe the 14-year-old who still believed that if my mother just saw it with her own eyes, the eyes would finally win, went and got Eli. He lifted his own sleeve this time, watching his grandmother's face with that same checking expression, waiting to see if the world would break. My mother looked at his arm for perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds for 3 welts still swollen at the edges. Then she straightened her purse in her lap and delivered the verdict she had clearly driven over already holding. Boys get whoopings, Dana, she said. Don't turn this into one of your things again. Again, that word did the work of a slap. It reached back 19 years, picked up a church hallway I hadn't thought about in a decade, and set it down on my kitchen table like a dish nobody had asked for. I said nothing. I poured her decaf and asked about the auxiliary's bake sale, and she drove home believing she'd settled things. She had no idea about the photographs, the case file, or the forensic interview already scheduled for 9 the following Monday. Here is the thing about being talked over your whole life. People mistake your quiet for surrender. That night I did laundry and left one item out. I sealed the denim jacket in a paper bag the way we bag evidence at the hospital when it might matter later, wrote the date across it in permanent marker, and set it on top of my refrigerator. Up where daily life couldn't accidentally touch it. Then I pinned the Advocacy Center's appointment card to the fridge door under a magnet shaped like a triceratops. My kitchen had become a case file whether I'd planned it that way or not. I called Eli's father in Colorado and told him everything in order, the nurse's way, dates first. He went silent long enough that I checked the call hadn't dropped. Then he said whatever I needed. He'd sign whatever I needed, and there was gravel in his voice I hadn't heard since before the divorce. By 11 that night, my sister-in-law Claire, Roy's daughter from his first marriage and someone I'd always gotten along with fine at a polite distance, had heard something through the family grapevine and texted me one line. Are you seriously doing this to Dad? Not is Eli okay? Not what did the doctor say? My family, it turned out, had already chosen its pronouns and my son wasn't in them. I didn't answer. I checked the locks, turned off the lights, and looked at the paper bag on the refrigerator one more time before bed. Tomorrow was still 5 days away, but a stranger behind a one-way mirror was going to ask my son about a garage belt, and there was one more thing I hadn't opened yet. Sitting quietly in an app on my phone. I hadn't thought about my own doorbell camera until I was brushing my teeth that night, and then I stopped brushing entirely. Sunday evening, my own porch, Roy handing Eli's bag over with that easy grin. I sat down on the bathroom floor in my scrubs and opened the app and scrolled back. 19 seconds. Roy's truck door. Eli climbing down slowly, hugging his backpack like a shield. And then, just before they stepped out of frame, Roy's hand closing hard around Eli's upper arm to hurry him along, and his voice, low and flat, catching just enough on the microphone. Quit dragging your feet or I'll give you a real reason to cry about it. Same tone Eli had described from the porch, same arm he'd flinched away from at bath time. I sat there on the cold tile and matched a video to an injury pattern the way I'd match a chart to a patient. What came over me wasn't rage yet, it was recognition. He'd said that on my own porch, under a camera he'd walked past 100 times because it never crossed his mind anything would come of it. Men like Roy don't hide because they've never had to. The whole town was his character witness, and my own mother had just volunteered to be another one. I saved 3 copies, phone, cloud, and an old laptop that never leaves my closet, because paperwork was the one language this family had ever taught me fluently. The Child Advocacy Center sits in a converted house downtown, painted soft blue, its waiting room full of donated stuffed animals that all look slightly too new. A woman named Priya came out in a cardigan, crouched to Eli's height, and introduced herself like they were about to be lab partners. One interview recorded once, so a child never repeats the worst thing that ever happened to him to a parade of strangers. No leading questions, no parent in the room. I would watch from behind the glass. I have delivered hard news to parents for 9 years and thought that had taught me something about helplessness. Then I stood in a dim little room and watched my own son through a one-way mirror, holding a paper cup of coffee I never drank. Your whole body leans toward that glass. The detective beside me glanced over twice before I realized I'd pressed my fingertips flat against the frame, as if I could hold the room steady from outside it. Priya started nowhere near Saturday. Favorite dinosaur? 2nd grade. The difference between the truth and a lie, which Eli explained using a story about a triceratops because of course he did. Then, with no change in her tone at all, Priya slid a box of crayons across the table and asked if he wanted to draw while they talked about the birthday weekend. Behind the glass, in the dark, I picked up my pen because whatever he was about to say, someone who loved him was going to write it down. I won't give you my son's entire hour because that hour belongs to him, but I'll give you what the written report later put in language flatter than screaming. Child disclosed being struck multiple times on the forearm and lower back with a belt following an accidental spill of fishing equipment. Child stated grandfather told him this was between men and not to be discussed with his mother. Child stated grandmother remained in another room during the incident. Then the part I hadn't braced for, the part that turned the observation room into a walk-in freezer. Priya asked gently whether Grandpa had rules like that just for him. Eli said no, easy as a spelling word. He said Grandpa does the same thing to boys on his old little leg team when they mess up a play, that it was just called discipline, and everybody knew not to make a big deal of it. The detective beside me wrote something quickly. I stood still, doing math I didn't want to do. 20 years of coaching, dozens of boys through that dugout, and a phrase, discipline, that apparently traveled with him from the field to the garage. My son wasn't the first. He was just the first one whose mother happened to chart for a living. That afternoon, I sat across a folding table from a caseworker named Ms. Farrell and gave her everything in order. Urgent care records already in the system, my photographs with a tape measure for scale. A flash drive with 19 seconds of doorbell footage, a cloud link, and a written page listing every date and time since Sunday at 6 p.m. She went through it once, then again slower, and looked up at me differently than when I first sat down. Documentation this complete, she said, I see maybe twice a year. I told her I'd chart for a living. It's the only thing my hands know how to do with fear. We signed a safety plan on the spot. No contact between Eli and Roy Kessler, pending investigation, full stop. Marcus's written consent came back before the ink on mine had dried. Ms. Farrell explained a CPS assessment would run alongside a police investigation. because a patterned injury combined with a recorded threat meant law enforcement was already involved. Then she paused, the way I pause in a trauma bay doorway deciding how much a family can absorb in one breath. There's something else you should know about the Little League Association. Tell me, I said, and she did. What she told me stays sealed for a little longer, because that same evening, my family got to the story before I could shape how they'd hear it. And I want you to feel the order of events the way I had to live them. At 9 that night, Claire sent a message to the entire extended family group chat, 14 people including 2 cousins out of state. Just so everyone hears it from me first, it read. Eli had some kind of accident with fishing hooks over the weekend and Dana's overreacting because of everything going on with the divorce. Dad would never hurt that boy. Please keep our family in your prayers right now. My sister-in-law took a diagnosis she invented out of thin air, wrapped it in a prayer request, and mailed it to everyone who shared our name. You cannot argue with a prayer request. Push back and you become exactly the difficult woman the message already accused you of being. Within the hour, an aunt called to mention therapy had worked wonders for her son after her own divorce. An uncle sent a thumbs-up emoji to nothing in particular, the quiet way men in my family choose sides. At 11, Claire texted me directly, just 2 words landing exactly the way my mother's had 2 days before. Boys bruise. My mother's sentence passed down like a recipe card nobody asked to inherit. I didn't respond. I opened my calendar and counted the days until Monday because I knew something the group chat didn't. The machine had already started and no prayer request could reach far enough to stop it. Eli slept with his lamp on that week. He'd never once been a lamp kid before. I found him Wednesday night curled around a stuffed triceratops with the light still burning, and stood in the doorway a long time before turning it off. Looking back at that paper bag sitting on my refrigerator like it was running my house. By Thursday, word reached the Little League board, and small towns don't stay quiet about that kind of paperwork for long. Roy was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon, and Cedar Ridge found out before the after-school pickup line cleared. Nobody official said a word, which meant everybody unofficial said all of them. Best coach my boy ever had, someone posted. This is what happens when a marriage falls apart and a mother needs someone to blame. Someone else wrote, without ever using my name, because small towns don't need names, they have arrows. And most pointed at me. Somebody started a meal train for my mother, it filled by the next morning. My mother, who had watched my son's arm for 4 seconds and delivered a verdict, received casseroles. While the 8-year-old with the belt marks got a prayer request with his name misspelled in the replies. That was the night I learned exactly what it costs to be right too early in a town that has already made up its mind. At 11:40 that same night, a message request came in from a name I didn't recognize, a woman whose son had played on Roy's team 3 seasons back. She'd complained to the league back then about bruising on her son's arm, about a phrase the boys used to repeat like a joke that wasn't really one. The board had thanked her for the feedback. The word in their file was unfounded. They made me feel like I was crazy, she wrote. My husband told me to let it go, everyone loved the man. Then one more line, is your son okay? I didn't know this woman, but I understood her completely, and she had kept every email the league had ever sent her dated and saved. That, it turned out, was the sealed piece of news Ms. Farrell hadn't finished telling me on Wednesday. That mother's old complaint had never fully died. It sat in a drawer at the league office stamped unfounded, waiting for a second data point that would make it impossible to ignore. I was the second data point. A patterned injury documented by a physician, a forensic disclosure that mentioned other boys by implication, a police case number, and 19 seconds of doorbell audio. When all of that landed on the state's youth sports licensing board, next to a 3-year-old complaint that rhymed with it almost exactly, the machine that had been quietly idling finally turned over. Friday morning, the State Athletics Oversight Board issued an emergency suspension of Roy Kessler's youth coaching certification, effective immediately, pending a full revocation hearing. The County Little League Association opened its own termination proceedings the same day. The local paper ran 2 paragraphs with no names attached, and Cedar Ridge filled in the names by lunchtime anyway. I sat with the news alone in my driveway that Friday afternoon and waited to feel whatever I was supposed to feel, and it simply didn't arrive. My son was still sleeping with his lamp on. My mother said nothing to anyone at all, and if you knew my mother, you would understand that her silence has never once meant peace. It means a held breath, silence I could handle. I had grown up fluent in it. It was Friday night just after 9 when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I thought about the caseworker, the detective, the league, a dozen official strangers who all had my number now, and I answered like a professional. It was my mother calling from a friend's phone. Sunday, she said, before even saying hello, you'll come to the house. The whole family needs to sit down and fix this while it can still be fixed. I waited for the question that never came. How's he sleeping? Does his arm still hurt? Is he scared of men now? My grandson, the boy who used to fall asleep on her shoulder during Christmas Eve service. Not once, not that call, not any call before or after it, did she ask. I looked down my own hallway at the yellow line of light under Eli's door and heard myself say, I'll come. Not because I owed that dining table anything. Because I'm a nurse and we don't skip the hard conversations, and because some doors you need to watch close with your own eyes. My mother's dining room hadn't changed a single frame on its walls in 20 years. Family photos marched up the staircase in matching gold frames, level as a hospital hallway, and growing up I thought that kind of order was what love looked like. Sunday at 2 o'clock, that room was arranged like a proceeding, an aunt and her husband on the sofa. Claire in the wing chair, eyes pink, and beside her one empty dining chair carried in and left vacant, which told me everything about who that chair was meant to represent. And that somebody in the family had decided it belonged there anyway, like a flag on an embassy lawn. I took the piano bench. Nobody offered me coffee, which in my mother's house is its own kind of verdict. On the table, squared perfectly to the wood grain, sat a single typed page in a font I recognized from a law office letterhead. They called it a clarifying statement. One paragraph, already drafted, in which I would acknowledge that I had misunderstood ordinary discipline, that Eli was known to bruise easily, and that the family considered the matter privately resolved. Considered it resolved. Somewhere a lawyer named Doug Prentice had typed those exact words, and my family had printed them on the good printer. All week I'd assumed Claire would be the one to slide that page toward me. I was wrong. My mother reached out and turned it to face me herself, smoothing it flat with one pass of her hand the way she smooths altar linens on Sunday mornings. And then she looked up at me with an expression I had never once seen in her eyes before. Hope. They took turns, almost choreographed. My aunt went first, asking me to think of the family name Roy had spent 30 years building. My uncle next, arms crossed, telling me a man teaches boys the way a man was taught. Then Claire, eyes wet, leaning in like we were still teenagers. You're destroying my father's life, Dana, his life. Not Eli's arm, not Eli's lamp burning every night at 2 in the morning. There is a kind of accounting where a man's reputation goes in the ledger, and a child's forearm never once makes the page. And I watched my whole family run that math fluently from memory. And threaded through every single voice in that room was the same refrain, passed around like a collection plate. This isn't about you, Dana. Stop making this about you. It's not about you. They'd said it to me at 14 in a church hallway. They were saying it now over a typed legal page. The remarkable thing is that they were completely right and not one of them could hear it. I let the room go quiet. Then I asked my only question in the voice I use with parents who won't look at an x-ray. Has one single person in this room asked how Eli is sleeping? 5 seconds. I counted them against the mantel clock my late step-grandfather had wound every Sunday of his life. My uncle looked out the window. Claire looked at her hands. My mother looked down at the page on the table. That was the whole family's answer, delivered in silence. My mother broke it herself because silence in that house has always belonged to her and she never lends it out for long. Sign it, Dana, she said, quietly, terribly kindly. Sign it and Sunday dinners go back to normal and we never speak of this again. Everyone makes mistakes, even you, even me. I looked at that page one more time, the font, the phrase considered it resolved, the blank line waiting patiently for my name. I thought about every chart I have signed in 9 years of nursing, how my signature has only ever meant one thing: this happened, you can build on this. They were asking me to spend the most honest thing I own on a piece of fiction. I stood up off the piano bench and buttoned my coat, and I said it without any heat at all, the way you read out a lab result. I signed charts, not fiction. Then I crossed the room, kissed my mother once on the cheek, and she let me, confused because some part of her could feel exactly what that kiss was and just couldn't name it yet. I could. It was the kiss you give a house on the morning the moving truck finally comes. I let the screen door close behind me on its own slow spring. It didn't slam, it clicked. Some doors close louder than any slam ever could. Tuesday's mail brought a thick envelope with a law firm's letterhead, the kind of paper meant to make your hands sweat before you've read a word. Doug Prentice, Esquire, representing Roy Kessler, advised me that my false and defamatory statements had damaged his client's reputation and demanded I cease and desist. I read it twice. The first read spiked my pulse, exactly the fee that letter was engineered to collect. The second read, I noticed what wasn't in it. It demanded I stop making statements without naming a single one because I hadn't made any. No posts, no group chat replies. Everything I knew had gone to exactly 3 places: a doctor, a caseworker, a detective. So I spent an hour and a consultation fee with an attorney 2 towns over. She read the letter in under 2 minutes and slid it back across her desk. Good faith reports to child welfare and licensing boards are protected under state law, she said. This is a scare letter and you'd be amazed how often it works. Not on someone Carol Kessler raised, I told her. I went home, wrote the date across the top of Prentice's letter, punched 3 holes in it, and clipped it into a binder, quietly becoming the largest thing I'd ever built. At the grocery store that week, 2 women I'd known for a decade switched checkout lanes to avoid me. I noticed I kept my spine straight and bought the good coffee anyway. That woman. I had become her without ever meaning to. Fine, that woman documents. The following Saturday, my mother showed up at my house unannounced and would not come past the porch. She stood there in her church coat, right under the little blue light of the doorbell camera, and if she noticed the irony, she never once let on. Eli was at his father's for the weekend. Maybe she knew that. She keeps the whole family calendar in her head like scripture. I'm going to tell you this once, she said, and then we're never speaking of it again. And on my own porch, my mother handed me the only real inheritance she had ever had to give. She was 22, she told me, long before Roy. Married young, to a man whose name she has never once said in my presence. The night she showed up at her own mother's house with her wrist broken in 2 places, my grandmother made her a cup of tea, wrapped the wrist in a dish towel, and told her boys will be boys and husbands will be husbands. Go home before he notices you slipped out. So she went home. I stayed 22 years, Dana, my mother said, and her voice didn't waver, which was somehow the worst part. You think I don't know exactly what I'm asking you to do? I'm asking you to do what I did because it's the only thing I've ever known how to survive. For one strange moment, she wasn't my judge. She was a 22-year-old with a dish towel around her own wrist, and the chain ran straight through her, 3 generations deep. She hadn't been protecting Roy at all. She'd been protecting the sentence that had cost her everything, because if that sentence wasn't sacred, what exactly had she spent her whole life paying for? Withdraw the report, she said. No, Mom, I told her, but I finally understand you now. She nodded once like a woman leaving a graveside and walked back to her car. 3 weeks later, the machine finished its first pass. Ms. Farrell called to tell me the finding was substantiated: physical abuse, safety plan standing indefinitely. That same week, Roy took a plea: misdemeanor child endangerment, probation, a behavioral program, and a permanent no-contact order with Eli. Signed in a real courtroom while I sat in the second row on my lunch break, still in scrubs. His lawyer had done exactly what lawyers do: contained it. A misdemeanor was a paper cut to a man like Roy. The wound that wouldn't close was the coaching license. The state athletics board's letter arrived that Friday, addressed to me. Witness notice enclosed. A full revocation hearing scheduled 5 weeks out in the state capitol. My testimony was requested, and one sentence sat at the bottom like a stone in my shoe. Hearings of the board are open to the public, and proceedings become part of the public record. There was more. Ms. Farrell told me the board's investigator had subpoenaed the leg's old files, and that 3-year-old complaint from the other mother was in the packet now too. Matched against the leg's dismissive replies. That mother had been summoned as well. The system that once shrugged at her was about to read its own handwriting out loud on a microphone. I stood at my counter holding that letter and understood the price tag on the words public record precisely. Cedar Ridge would hear every word I said under oath. My family would hear every word. 2 words that would cost me the last thing I had left. You should know that by then I already had everything I'd technically set out to get. Sit with that because I had to. The finding was substantiated. The no-contact order carried a judge's real signature. Roy would never be alone with my son again as long as I was alive to prevent it, and his career in this state was already functionally over. Whatever I did next, the board already had the file, the plea, the prior complaint. My testimony was requested, not required. I could skip the Capitol entirely and the machine would grind forward anyway, just slower, quieter, and far more appealable. What exactly was I standing up in that room for then? I was still turning that question over 2 nights later when my bedroom door creaked at 2 in the morning, and Eli padded in with his triceratops and folded himself against my side. I thought he'd drifted back off when his voice came up small and completely awake. Is Grandpa going to coach a different team somewhere else? 8 years old, and he'd already found the exact hole in the fence. Surrender a certification quietly, and 2 hours down the highway there are leagues that will welcome a charming man with 2 decades of trophies and no felony. Unless somebody stands up in a public record and staples the story together, on purpose, out loud. I don't know, baby, I told him, which that night was the honest truth. He was asleep again within minutes. I lay there until the window went gray. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand a little after 6. A voicemail, unknown number. My mother had gotten up early too. I sat on the edge of my bed and played it. My mother's voice came out gentler than I've ever heard it, gentler than any lullaby she ever sang me because she never sang those. She'd been to see Prentice. It was all arranged, nearly signed. Roy would voluntarily surrender his certification before the hearing date. He and my mother would move out of state, a fresh start, she called it. The hearing would simply be canceled, nothing left to revoke. He's gone, Dana, out of your life, out of the boy's life for good. You get everything you wanted. A long pause, tape hiss. All you have to do is not go to the Capitol, don't testify, let it end quietly. And then, honey, you come home, Sunday dinner, your chair like none of this happened. Don't make me choose in front of the whole church. Please come home. I sat there in the gray morning light, and I want to be honest about what that voicemail actually was because it would be easy to lie. It was not a threat. It was the single most generous offer my mother had made me in 33 years. By her own arithmetic, she was handing me the whole estate back, the enemy banished, the daughter restored. And the terrible thing, the thing I couldn't have said out loud with Eli asleep down the hall, is that I wanted it. Some 14-year-old still living inside me wanted it so badly my teeth ached. There was only one item missing from the arrangement, and it was never going to be mine to give away. I didn't call anyone that night, and I noticed that about myself. At some point, being a grown adult means the hotline is you. I took the offer apart the way I'd take apart a suspicious chart, line by line, voluntarily surrender his certification. I'm a nurse. I know what happens when a problem gets transferred instead of resolved. We have a phrase for professionals who resign quietly right before a review board convenes. Passing the trash, we call it ugly and accurate. A quiet surrender becomes a clean-looking gap on a resume 2 states away, where a charming man with 2 decades of trophies and no felony fills out an application. And some mother I'll never meet fights to get her son onto his roster. A surrender ends the paperwork. A revocation sworn in public follows the man. I stood there doing that math, and then I made myself do the other column too, because honesty was the entire point now. Sunday dinner, my chair. My mother alive, not yet old, and the years still ahead of her, and Eli in a grandmother's kitchen at Christmas, and the word home meaning an address again instead of a wound. That column was real. Anyone who tells you it weighs nothing has never actually had a mother. I walked down the hall and stood in Eli's doorway, watching him sleep with the lamp still burning, one arm around his triceratops, sleeve ridden up. The faint yellow shadow of an old bruise still visible if you knew exactly where to look. I knew where to look. Somewhere out there were other boys whose mothers didn't. 9 a.m., one more appointment on the calendar. All I had left to decide was whether I was going to be a filing cabinet or a witness. The hearing room at the state capitol was smaller than television teaches you to expect. A U-shaped arrangement of tables, a state flag drooping in the corner, a stenographer whose fingers never stopped moving. A handful of public chairs, mostly empty, second row, aisle seat, a church hat squared level as a picture frame. My mother, she hadn't come to support me. She'd come because hope dies hard in a woman that organized, and some part of her believed, right up until the final minute, that I'd look at those empty chairs and lose my nerve and come home. The other mother, the one from the message weeks earlier, sat 3 seats down from her, clutching a folder of printed emails, and the two of them didn't know each other. And between them sat everything wrong with how a town chooses to love its men. I was called, I carried my binder to the witness table, 9 weeks of my life packed into 3 rings, and set it down square to the table's edge. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I left it closed. Paper doesn't get tired and paper doesn't get scared, but paper doesn't get to choose either, and today was about choosing. I raised my right hand, I swore. Then in the voice I use for shift change handoffs, no adjectives, no tremor, dates first, I told them about a denim jacket in April. Urgent care, 9:40 p.m., 3 welts and a bruise, photographed with a tape measure for scale. The forensic interview at the Advocacy Center, Monday, 9 a.m. I asked the board's counsel for permission to enter one item into the public record, 19 seconds of video from my own front door, audio intact, alongside my written timeline. So the next league that looks up his name, I said, finds more than a list of trophies. Counsel looked to the chair nodded. In a quiet room, in front of a state flag and a stenographer and my mother's level hat, they pressed play. You could hear the truck door twice, once from the speakers and once bouncing off the rear wall of a room built for reading statutes out loud. Then his voice, the after-hours voice 200 families never got to hear, filling a state hearing room at official volume. Quit dragging your feet or I'll give you a real reason to cry about it. Nobody gasped. That isn't what rooms like that do. They go still all at once, the exact way a hospital ward goes still when a monitor alarm sounds. In that stillness, I watched the board members carefully not look at each other, and I watched my mother in the second row, whom I hadn't stopped watching since I raised my right hand. She stood up while the recording was still playing, gathered her purse the way she gathers hymnals, unhurried with terrible dignity, and walked out of the room. And the door was still easing shut when the board's counsel asked me his final question. Mrs. Whitfield, you understand that members of your own family have characterized this testimony as personally motivated. Every face at the U of tables came up and waited. I leaned toward the microphone and answered him, and answered the closing door, and answered a dining room with a typed legal page on it 19 days gone. It was never about me, I said. That was always the point. And there, with my hand flat on a binder I never once had to open, a strange calm settled over me, and I finally understood my own steadiness for the first time in my life. I had carried paper my whole life because I believed my own word alone had never once weighed enough. My family had set that number for me a long time ago, and I had simply accepted it. The binder was never armor. It was a permission slip I kept renewing, and I was finally done renewing it. 40 minutes later, the board voted unanimously to permanently revoke the youth coaching certification of Roy Kessler, with the finding reported to the National Coaching Misconduct Registry. Flagged in every state. Both doors of that sentence closed at the same moment. He would never coach a child again anywhere in this country, and my mother's car was already gone from the lot. In the hallway outside, the other mother caught my sleeve and hugged me the way family is supposed to and so rarely does. They told me I imagined it, she said into my shoulder, wet-eyed, furious, finally free. 3 years and you wrote every single thing down. She testified right after me, her dates matching her emails matching the LIG's file. And I watched a board member read a decade-old dismissive form letter into the record at full volume. The machine wasn't only taking away one man's certification, it was reading its own handwriting back out loud, and rooms tend to change after that. Out in the parking lot, the spot where my mother had parked sat empty, a clean rectangle of dry asphalt in an otherwise wet lot. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a plain note card, cream-colored, 3 words in her familiar blue ballpoint folded once. You chose, no signature. She knew I'd recognize the handwriting. I sat in the driver's seat a while with the engine off, watching raindrops gather and slide, and then I said it out loud alone to the rearview mirror, to that empty rectangle of asphalt, to her. Yes, finally. I slid the card into the binder as the last exhibit, case closed, and drove home doing exactly the speed limit. Because there was a second grader getting out of school at 3:15 who needed picking up, and for the first time in 9 weeks I had good news that belonged only to him. It's been a little over 4 months now, long enough to count what a single choice actually cost. Roy and my mother moved 2 states away that autumn. She stayed with him. I've stopped being surprised by that. The certification never traveled with them. Revoked is revoked, flagged in the registry, every state permanently. Somewhere out there is a mother I will never meet whose son will get a different coach next season and never once know why. That's the whole prize. It was worth exactly what it cost, and those two facts have learned to live together quietly in my house now like an old married couple. My mother and I haven't spoken since that hearing. A birthday card came for Eli in December anyway, a $20 bill folded inside, signed simply Grandma in blue ballpoint, no note, no mention of anything at all. That's the family's version of love, with every load-bearing wall quietly removed. I let Eli decide what to do with it because that's the house I run now. He read it twice, said tell her thank you, and stuck it to the fridge with the Triceratops magnet down low at exactly his height, a full arm's length below where that paper bag used to sit. The bag itself is gone. The court returned the denim jacket after the plea, and I asked Eli what he wanted done with it, braced for anything at all. He thought about it the way he thinks through dinosaur facts and said donate it. Some kid might just be cold. So we washed it together and dropped it in the bin outside the community center. The top of my refrigerator holds nothing now but dust, and a casserole dish nobody is ever coming back to reclaim. Eli turned his lamp off for good sometime around the 9th week. Neither of us said anything about it. His counselor told me more in one sentence than any chart ever could. He knows the adults handled it. Last month at the grocery store, a distant cousin leaned down at Eli with his arms wide open the way men in my family do with kids they barely know. Hug for your uncle, come on now. My son took half a step back and looked up at me, not scared, checking which kind of family he actually lives in now. You don't have to hug anybody you don't want to, I told him, and the man straightened up, embarrassed, and made some joke to cover it. And Eli slipped his hand into mine, and we finished paying for our groceries. Somewhere 3 generations back, a chain that had never once been tested finally simply did not hold. It's a quiet Saturday morning now. There's an 8-year-old at my kitchen table narrating a whole imaginary documentary about Triceratops to a bowl of cereal, wearing a hoodie he picked out himself, bright yellow. Loud as a school bus, unzipped, because he has absolutely nothing left to hide. I still write everything down, but it's different now. I used to write things down so somebody would finally be forced to believe me. Now I write them down to remember how far we've come. My mother told me boys bruise, and she wasn't wrong. She was only ever finishing the sentence too early, the way her own mother taught her to. Boys bruise. They also heal if somebody finally stops pretending not to see. I lost my mother's table and I kept my son's voice. If that's the price of a child growing up certain he'll always be believed, I paid it, and I'd pay it again without blinking. That's my story. One denim jacket in April, one sentence from my own mother, and a 9 a.m. appointment that quietly rearranged 2 families for good. If this reminded you of a child who just needs one adult willing to believe them, be that adult. Write it down, time and date. And if this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments which line hit hardest, and share it with someone who might need to read it today.